At my sister's extravagant investor party, I accidentally spilled a drop of water. Her husband violently shoved me to the floor, splashing red wine across my event script. "You're just a hired voice," he hissed. "Clean it up and leave." My own sister watched, demanding I apologise to save his pitch. So, I walked away in silence. But my lapel microphone was still active. The audio booth heard everything, and my arrogant brother-in-law had no idea that within 24 hours, my hired voice would legally evict him from the very mansion he was trying to sell. If this resonates, tell me where you are listening from. The banquet hall went entirely silent. Over 200 guests, mostly potential investors for Brandon's failing real estate firm, stared at the dark stains spreading across my silk dress. The fabric was ruined, but my pulse remained completely steady. I slowly gathered my scattered script pages from the polished hardwood floor. I didn't tremble. I didn't shed a single tear. Panic is a luxury I stopped affording myself years ago. Seats. Jessica stepped out from the crowd. She was wearing a designer gown I had quietly paid for 3 months prior, though she would never admit that to her wealthy friends. I expected my sister to help me up. Instead, she looked at the spilled wine, then at Brandon, and finally at me. Her expression was carefully blank, calculated to protect her social standing. "Just apologise to him. Ava," Jessica whispered, keeping her voice incredibly low so the important guests would not hear. "Do not ruin this night for us. You know how much this investment pitch means to Brandon." I looked at Jessica. She was actively choosing the illusion of high society over her own flesh and blood. She was choosing to stroke the fragile pride of a man who had just shoved a woman to the ground simply to look dominant. I stood up to my full height, smoothing out the ruined fabric of my dress with slow, deliberate hands. I reached up to my collar and calmly unclipped the lapel microphone. I wound the thin wire neatly, placing the device on a nearby cocktail table. "I will not apologise," I said, my voice perfectly level and clear enough to carry to the first row of guests. "And I will not stay," Brandon scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Then leave. We do not need you here anyway." I turned and walked toward the grand mahogany double doors. The crowd parted for me. People murmured, holding their expensive champagne flutes tight against their chests. Near the exit, an older gentleman in a dark grey suit stood watching the entire ordeal. He was a prominent investor, but more importantly, he was an old friend of Arthur. Arthur was my late grandfather. The older man caught my eye and gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. He saw the exact truth of what had just happened. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped out into the cool evening air of the Seattle suburbs. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of forced laughter as Brandon tried desperately to salvage the mood of his precious pitch. He was likely telling the crowd that I was always dramatic. He was likely assuring them that the $1.5 million estate we were standing in proved his absolute financial stability. He believed the walls around him belonged to him. He was a fool. I drove into the dark. My profession requires absolute precision. As an event host and master of ceremonies, I do not simply read words from a prompter. I control the breathing of an entire room. I know exactly when to pause for emphasis, when to lower my pitch to draw people in, and when to project authority. Brandon mocked me as a mere hired voice, failing to realise that a voice trained to command thousands of people does not break under the weight of a fragile man's temper. As I drove down the winding suburban roads, I thought about the brochures Brandon had scattered across the banquet tables. I had seen them earlier that afternoon during the sound check. They were printed on thick, glossy paper, featuring high-resolution photographs of the very house we were standing in. The text proudly referred to the estate as the flagship asset in Brandon's development portfolio. He had set up easels displaying architectural renderings, showing how he planned to tear down the historic walls to build a modern corporate retreat. He was essentially trying to sell the legacy of my grandfather to keep his sinking company afloat. The house was a masterpiece of classic craftsman architecture, built by Arthur's own hands over 40 years ago. Every wooden beam, every stained glass window, and every stone in the fireplace held a piece of our family history. Yet, Brandon walked through those halls as if he had laid the foundation himself. He invited investors into a home he did not earn, pouring expensive wine he could not actually afford. He thought talking was cheap. He thought my career was nothing more than looking presentable and speaking clearly into a microphone. But a professional speaker understands the immense weight of documented truth. A professional speaker knows that a narrative built on a foundation of lies will collapse the moment a single structural flaw is exposed. I parked my car in the quiet lot of my small apartment complex. I did not feel the sting of humiliation anymore. The cold dampness of the wine on my dress had dried, leaving behind a stiff, dark reminder of his public disrespect. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence of my vehicle. I visualized the polished floors of the estate, the grand staircase, and the sprawling garden where Arthur used to sit and carve wooden toys. Brandon thought he had successfully kicked me out of his territory. He thought he had asserted his dominance in front of the people who held his financial future in their hands. He had no idea. To understand the full depth of Brandon's cruelty, you have to look back at how the morning began. Long before the catering trucks arrived and the floral arrangements were placed around the estate. The house was quiet. I had arrived early to check the audio equipment. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed an unnatural silence. Barnaby, my grandfather's golden retriever, was nowhere to be found. Barnaby was 14 years old. He had severe arthritis in his back legs and spent most of his days sleeping on a braided rug near the kitchen window. He was a gentle, quiet soul who simply wanted to be near people. But Brandon despised the dog. He claimed Barnaby smelled old, that his shedding ruined the expensive rugs, and that the sight of a limping animal was depressing for guests. "Where is Barnaby?" I had asked Jessica as she frantically directed the florists. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Brandon put him in the unfinished basement," she mumbled, adjusting a vase of white lilies. "Just for tonight. Ava, we cannot have a shedding dog wandering around when the investors arrive. It looks unprofessional." My chest tightened. The basement was damp, cold, and entirely concrete. For an old dog with joint pain, it was pure misery. Before I could argue, I felt a small tug on my sleeve. It was Mia, my 7-year-old niece. She was wearing a neat little dress, holding a stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. I knelt down to her eye level, forcing a warm smile so she wouldn't sense my rising anger. "Are you excited for the party, sweetheart?" I asked softly. Mia shook her head. She leaned in close to my ear, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "Uncle Brandon said I am not allowed to leave my room tonight," she confided. "He said I should pack my favourite toys in a box. He told me not to decorate my walls anymore because someone new is coming to see the house." The words sent a sudden chill straight through my spine. Someone new is coming to see the house. Mia was just a child, repeating a fragment of a conversation she was never meant to hear. But those innocent words carried a terrifying implication. You do not tell a child to pack her toys simply because you are hosting a dinner party. You tell a child to pack her toys when you are preparing to move. I had brushed it off at the time, assuming Brandon was just making empty threats to keep Mia out of the way. But as I sat in my dark car outside my apartment, Mia's whisper echoed loudly in my mind. He was not just putting on a show for the investors. He was actively preparing to liquidate the property. He was planning to discard the house, the dog, and the legacy. I grabbed my keys, People often ask how someone can stand by and watch their own sibling be treated with such profound disrespect. They wonder what kind of sister tells you to apologise to the man who just assaulted you. To understand Jessica, you have to understand the slow, quiet trap of normalisation. Evil rarely announces itself all at once. It creeps in through small compromises, tiny concessions made to keep the peace. Jessica was not born cruel. Growing up, she was simply the golden child, the one who craved validation and beautiful things. When she married Brandon, she thought she was stepping into a life of endless luxury. But Brandon's wealth was built on aggressive leverage and shifting debts. When the market tightened, his true nature emerged, instead of leaving. Jessica adapted. She learned that as long as she smiled for the cameras, hosted perfect dinners, and never questioned his authority, she could keep her expensive illusion intact. I became the silent pillar holding that illusion up. Over the past 4 years, I was the one who quietly paid the utility bills when Brandon's accounts were frozen. I was the one who covered Mia's ballet lessons and paediatric appointments. I never asked for gratitude, and Jessica never offered any. To acknowledge my financial help would be to admit her husband was a fraud. It was much easier for her to treat me as an extension of the household staff, a reliable resource that existed solely to fix their problems. She sacrificed her moral boundaries to protect her status. When Brandon shoved me and ruined my script, Jessica did not see a brother-in-law attacking her sister. She saw a threat to her carefully curated image. Her demand for me to apologise was not about right or wrong. It was a desperate attempt to patch the crack in her perfect glass house before the investors noticed. As I unlocked the door to my apartment, I realised that my own silence had enabled this dynamic. By constantly absorbing the financial shocks and swallowing my pride to protect Mia. I had taught Brandon and Jessica that I had no boundaries. I had taught them that my dignity was a currency they could spend freely. I turned on the lights in my small living room. I walked straight to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick, fireproof lockbox. I traced my fingers over the combination dial. Jessica believed she was preserving her future by pushing me out the door. Brandon believed he had eliminated the only obstacle to his grand financial scheme. They were both living inside a very expensive fantasy. I entered the numerical code before I opened the fireproof lockbox on my desk. I needed to change out of my ruined clothes. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom and looked at the dark, jagged stains spreading across the pale silk of my dress. The fabric was stiff and smelled sharply of fermented grapes. Brandon had not merely ruined an expensive piece of clothing. He had attempted to ruin a symbol. My grandfather, Arthur, bought this dress for me 5 years ago. He was a master carpenter, a man whose hands were permanently calloused from decades of shaping raw timber into magnificent architecture. He understood the immense value of honest, disciplined labour. On the day I booked my very first major corporate hosting event, he took me to a boutique downtown. I remember hesitating at the price tag. Arthur simply handed his card to the cashier. "Your voice is your trade. Ava," he told me as we walked out of the store. "It is the tool you use to build your life. You dress it with respect, and you never, ever let anyone mute your microphone." I carefully unzipped the dress and let it fall to the floor. Arthur was a man who observed everything and said very little. He saw the way Brandon operated. He saw the aggressive posturing, the endless need for external validation, and the hollow core beneath the tailored suits. He also saw how Jessica moulded herself to fit Brandon's artificial world, slowly abandoning her own moral compass to maintain her comfortable lifestyle. Arthur knew exactly what would happen when his health began to fail. He knew Brandon would immediately circle the estate like a vulture waiting for an opportunity to strike. That was why my grandfather made his legal arrangements entirely in secret. He wanted to protect his life's work. But more importantly, he wanted to protect the granddaughter who actually respected it. I picked up the stained silk dress from the floor. I did not throw it in the trash. Instead, I carefully folded it and placed it inside a plastic dry cleaning bag. I wanted to keep it exactly as it was. I wanted a physical reminder of the exact moment my family crossed a line they could never uncross. The stain was not a mark of my humiliation. It was a receipt of his fatal error. I put on clean clothes, with fresh clothes on. I finally sat down at my desk and opened the heavy steel lockbox. Inside rested a thick, pristine legal folder containing the absolute truth about the estate. To the outside world, Brandon was the lord of the manor. He regularly hosted lavish dinners, loudly complaining to his guests about the exorbitant costs of historic home maintenance. He claimed he was the one preserving the architectural integrity of the neighbourhood. The documents in front of me told a completely different story. When Jessica and Brandon first faced bankruptcy 3 years ago, they came to Arthur begging for a place to stay. Brandon promised it would only be for 6 months. Arthur agreed to let them move into the estate, but he refused to simply hand over the keys. He insisted on a formal, notarized contract. It was called a conditional occupancy agreement. The rent my grandfather charged them was exactly $1 per year. I reached into the folder and pulled out a copy of a signed receipt. It felt almost comical. Brandon paraded around the country club acting like a real estate titan, yet he lived in a multi-million-dollar mansion for less than the cost of a cup of coffee. The agreement explicitly stated that the occupants possessed no equity, no ownership rights, and absolutely no authority to use the property as collateral. Brandon believed he was outsmarting the system. Over the years, he started paying for superficial cosmetic changes. He repainted the dining room. He installed a flashy, modern chandelier in the foyer. He carefully kept all those invoices, inflating the numbers and routing the payments through a contractor friend. He was trying to establish what the law calls an equitable interest. He wanted a paper trail to argue that he had significantly invested in the property, thereby earning a partial right to its value. But he was building an empire of sand. He did not know that I possessed the master ledger. I was the one who quietly paid the massive annual property taxes. I paid the premium insurance policies. Whenever a structural repair was needed, the funds came directly from the trust maintenance account, legally authorised by my signature. Brandon was essentially putting cheap lipstick on a masterpiece he did not own. He operated under the dangerous assumption that a loud voice and a few fancy invoices could override an ironclad legal boundary. He confused the act of residing with the right of ownership. He was about to learn the difference. I turned the page. Before reviewing the rest of the legal documents, I needed to salvage my work for the following morning. I pulled my damaged script from my leather tote bag. The thick cardstock pages were warped and sticking together, stained pink along the edges from Brandon's careless outburst. I carefully laid them out on my desk to dry. My job required me to memorize these pages perfectly. But right now, I was only focused on separating them without tearing the paper. As I gently peeled page 4 away from page 5, something small and yellow fell onto the desk. It was a square sticky note. It must have been stuck to the back of my script when Brandon aggressively shoved the pages against his own jacket. Or perhaps it tumbled out of his breast pocket during the brief physical scuffle. The paper was slightly damp, and the black ink had bled just a fraction, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. It was written in sharp, hurried capital letters. I leaned in closer to read the text. It was a schedule. It listed a time for the following morning, specifically 9:30, alongside the name of a major commercial lending bank. Next to the bank's name was a 12-digit serial number, which looked exactly like a commercial loan application code. But It was the sentence scrawled heavily beneath the numbers that made my breathing slow to a complete stop. Thickly underlined twice. The note read, "Ava must not see this." I stared at the yellow square for a long time. The puzzle pieces were rapidly sliding into place. Brandon did not just hate me, he was actively hiding a major financial transaction from me. He had scheduled a bank appraisal for the very next morning. That was the real reason Barnaby the dog had been banished to the cold, concrete basement. A bank appraiser walking through a pristine, staged property would not want to step over an aging, shedding golden retriever. That was also the real reason little Mia had been instructed to pack her toys into boxes. The appraisal was just the final step. Brandon was fully preparing to liquidate the property or leverage it to the absolute limit. He was pushing the paperwork through under the radar, hoping to secure the funding before anyone asked any difficult legal questions. He thought he had successfully removed me from the equation by throwing me out of the party. He thought his secret was completely secure, in his pocket. Instead, his own violent temper had literally handed me the blueprint of his fraud. I picked up my phone. The yellow note proved Brandon was executing a major financial maneuver, but a commercial bank would not simply hand over a massive loan without seeing significant liquid assets. Brandon's company had been hemorrhaging cash for 2 years. I knew for a fact his personal accounts were heavily overdrawn. He needed cash to prove his liquidity. A terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. It was a thought so dark I almost felt guilty for entertaining it, but I could no longer afford the luxury of trusting my sister. 3 years ago, when Mia turned 4, I quietly opened a college savings fund for her. I wanted to make sure that no matter how recklessly her father managed his business, her educational future would remain completely secure. I deposited a percentage of my hosting fees into that account every single month, because I wanted to avoid unnecessary family drama. I made Jessica the joint custodian of the account. I believed a mother would fiercely protect her daughter's future. I opened my laptop and navigated to the banking portal. My fingers were entirely steady as I typed in my secure password. The dashboard loaded. I clicked on the specific tab for Mia's educational trust. The balance displayed on the glowing screen was $0.0. My eyes remained fixed on the digital numbers. I clicked on the transaction history, watching the screen populate with months of quiet, systematic theft. There were no major lump sum transfers that would trigger a bank alert. Instead, there were dozens of smaller, calculated withdrawals. I read the descriptions attached to the outbound money: payments to a luxury car rental service, invoices from a high-end boutique catering company, wire transfers to a digital marketing agency to buy fake followers and artificial engagement for Jessica's social media profiles. They had drained a child's future to finance a single evening of fake prosperity. The extravagant floral arrangements, the expensive wine Brandon had thrown at me, the polished facade they presented to the investors, it was all paid for by the money I had sacrificed to save for my niece. Jessica had allowed this. She had logged into an account meant for her daughter's education and transferred the funds to pay for the illusion of her husband's success. She had stolen from her own child just to keep up appearances. The anger that filled the room was completely silent. It was not a fiery, explosive rage. It was cold. It was absolute. Any lingering trace of familial guilt vanished from my conscience. They had crossed the final boundary. I closed the laptop. Everything that happened tonight was a carefully orchestrated, theatrical performance. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, mapping out the entire architecture of Brandon's trap. The lavish event was never a simple housewarming party. It was a high-pressure financial squeeze. Brandon's company was drowning. He had gathered his remaining prospective investors in one room to force their hands. He needed them to sign official letters of intent before the night ended. To achieve that, he had to project an image of undeniable wealth and absolute stability. That was why he needed the house. The grand architecture and historic value provided a physical manifestation of success. That was why he needed Jessica draped in designer gowns, acting as the perfectly unbothered, affluent hostess. And most sickeningly, that was why he needed me. He did not invite me out of familial obligation. He asked me to host the evening because my professional presence, my trained voice, and my industry reputation lent a crucial layer of legitimacy to his fraudulent event. I was not a guest. I was a prop. When the wine spilled, my reaction threatened to break the illusion. Brandon shoved me to the ground not merely out of anger, but to assert immediate dominance. He needed the investors to see him as the undisputed master of the domain. He needed to prove he was in total control. By forcing Jessica to choose him over me, he demonstrated his absolute authority. But his entire performance rested on a fatal assumption. Brandon truly believed that my grandfather had died without updating his estate plans. He assumed the property was simply tied up in a standard, slow-moving probate process that he could easily manipulate or stall. He believed the conditional occupancy agreement was just a piece of paper he could ignore. He was wrong. He had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of stolen money and forged confidence. He was relying on the bank appraisal scheduled for the morning to finalise his loan, using Mia's emptied college fund to fake his current liquidity. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a family that was too weak to fight back. He did not know I had the actual deed in my lockbox. He did not know that Arthur had secured everything inside an irrevocable trust. And he did not know that by physically pushing me and publicly humiliating me, he had just triggered the exact legal clause designed to destroy him. The trap was fully set, but he was the one standing inside it. I picked up the documents. I did not sleep that night. By 8 o'clock the following morning, I was sitting inside the polished mahogany office of Eleanor Davis. Eleanor was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm. But more importantly, she had been Arthur's closest confidant for over 30 years. She was a woman constructed entirely of sharp angles and even sharper intellect. She did not offer me pity when I explained the events of the previous evening. She simply opened a thick, heavy drawer behind her desk. Eleanor was the designated legal gatekeeper of my grandfather's legacy. She pulled out a green file folder and placed it squarely on the desk between us. "I have been waiting for your call, Ava," Eleanor said quietly, her silver-framed glasses reflecting the morning light. "Brandon is moving much faster than we originally anticipated." She opened the folder to reveal a piece of paper attached to a certified mail receipt. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor had drafted a formal legal warning and sent it directly to the estate. The letter explicitly demanded that Brandon cease all activities representing himself as the legal owner of the property. It ordered him to immediately remove the house from any commercial business portfolios or investment marketing materials. I looked at the bottom of the certified receipt. There, scrawled in bold blue ink, was Brandon's signature. He had received the letter. He had read the strict legal boundaries explicitly outlined by a senior attorney. He had been given a clear, undeniable warning to stop his fraudulent behaviour. Yet, he completely ignored it. He likely told Jessica that Eleanor was just an old woman trying to intimidate them with meaningless paperwork. He believed his sheer audacity could override the actual law. His arrogance was truly a blinding condition. Arthur had instructed Eleanor to only step in if Brandon actively violated the boundaries of the conditional lease. By hiding this letter from me and continuing to leverage the house to investors, Brandon had crossed the legal threshold. "He thinks he is immune to consequences," Eleanor stated, tapping her silver pen against the desk. "He is operating under the assumption that we are too polite to stop him." I looked down at his arrogant, rushed signature on the postal receipt. He had mistaken our civilized silence for weakness. He ignored the warning. Eleanor turned over the next document in the heavy green folder. It was a digital copy of a commercial loan application that Brandon had submitted to a major lending institution just 2 days prior. The numbers printed on the application were staggering. He was requesting a massive line of credit to save his failing development firm, and he had listed my grandfather's estate as the primary collateral guaranteeing the loan. The bank flagged this application internally, Eleanor explained, pointing to a specific highlighted section on the second page. Because the property is held in an irrevocable trust, they required a formal trustee authorization form to proceed with the underwriting process. She slid a single piece of paper across the desk. It was the authorization form. My eyes scanned the printed text, verifying that the trustee permitted the property to be encumbered by Brandon's corporate debt. At the very bottom of the page, resting on the designated line, was an electronic signature bearing my full legal name. "I never signed this," I said, my voice completely flat. "I know," Eleanor replied calmly. "Look closer at the associated metadata." Beneath the digital signature was a timestamp and an email address. The address looked exactly like my professional contact email at first glance, but a single letter had been subtly swapped. Brandon had created a fake digital identity to execute the electronic signature, but the most damning piece of evidence was the supplementary documentation attached to the back of the form. It was a scanned copy of my old state identification card. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. 7 months ago, Jessica had frantically texted me while I was preparing for a conference. She claimed Mia's elementary school needed to update their emergency contact protocols immediately and required a copy of my identification for their files. I had quickly snapped a photo of my card and sent it to my sister, trusting her implicitly because it concerned the safety of my niece. Jessica had lied. She had weaponized my love for her daughter to steal my identity. She had handed that document to her husband so he could commit financial fraud and leverage the very roof over her child's head. The betrayal was so deep, so mathematically calculated, that it completely severed whatever invisible thread still connected me to my sister. They stole my name. I thought the forged signature was the absolute bottom of their moral decay. I was incorrect. Eleanor reached for her computer mouse and clicked on a digital audio file attached to the bank's supplementary evidence portfolio. Brandon submitted this alongside the financial records to assure the loan officers that the entire family was fully on board with the redevelopment, Eleanor said, pressing the spacebar to play the file. The sound of my own voice filled the quiet office. "I am fully aware of the business proposals. Our family completely supports this redevelopment and the financial restructuring required." I sat perfectly still, listening to the recording play twice. It was definitely my voice. The tone, the pitch, the professional cadence. It was unmistakably me. But I had never spoken those words in that specific sequence. Then another memory surfaced. 4 weeks earlier, Brandon had cornered me in the hallway of the estate. He was holding a professional digital recorder, claiming he was testing the acoustic reverberation for an upcoming corporate podcast he wanted to launch. He had asked me to read a series of random, disjointed sentences as a favour to help him calibrate his audio levels. I had obliged, thinking it was a harmless, trivial request to keep the peace. He had recorded my voice, chopped the sentences into individual syllables, and digitally spliced them back together to create a counterfeit endorsement. As a professional master of ceremonies, my voice is my entire livelihood. It is my instrument, my reputation, and my core identity. Brandon had not simply forged a document, he had hijacked my professional tool to legitimize his criminal fraud. But because he was not a trained speaker, he had made critical errors. "Listen to the breath control," I told Eleanor, leaning closer to the computer speakers. The intake of air is completely unnatural. The pacing between the words family and completely drops 2 decibels without an exhalation. It is a fabricated splice. Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression grim. A forensic audio analyst will tear this apart in 5 minutes. Brandon had stolen my money. He had stolen my name. And finally, he had attempted to steal the very voice I used to survive. He thought I was just a woman who read scripts. He did not realize I knew exactly how to dismantle his... He stole my voice. The evidence sitting on Eleanor's mahogany desk was catastrophic. Brandon had committed multiple acts of severe financial fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. The documentation was absolute and entirely indisputable. Eleanor neatly aligned the edges of the green folder. "Ava," she began, her tone shifting from an investigative lawyer to a protective mentor. "We have enough here to utterly destroy him. I can file an emergency injunction with the courts by noon. We can freeze his corporate accounts, notify the commercial lending bank of the active fraud, and issue a quiet cease and desist regarding the property. We can resolve this entirely behind closed doors." I looked at the folder, and then I looked down at the large tote bag resting beside my chair. Inside that bag was my ruined silk dress, still smelling faintly of sour wine. "No," I answered smoothly. Eleanor paused, raising one eyebrow in silent questioning. "If we solve this behind closed doors, Brandon will simply spin the narrative," I explained, my voice remaining perfectly level. "He will tell the country club that he decided not to pursue the project. He will tell Jessica that the bank made a technical error. He will walk away with his fragile ego intact, and he will eventually try this again." I thought about the 200 wealthy investors currently sitting in my grandfather's garden. I thought about the way Brandon had shoved me to the ground and demanded an apology while the entire crowd watched. He had used an audience to publicly strip away my dignity. He had weaponized those people to make himself look like a powerful, untouchable king. He chose to humiliate me on a public stage. I said, meeting Eleanor's sharp gaze. He used his guests as a weapon against me. Therefore, he must be dismantled in front of that exact same audience. They need to see the truth. The execution must be public. If you agree that public disrespect requires a very public correction, tell me in the comments. Eleanor studied my face for a long, silent moment. She did not see a frightened victim. She saw Arthur's granddaughter. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across the older attorney's face. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a stack of official court seals. I chose the stage. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in quiet, lethal efficiency. Eleanor and I did not rush. We did not panic. We systematically compiled the absolute destruction of Brandon's life into a single, sleek, black leather portfolio. First, we printed the certified original copies of the irrevocable trust, highlighting the specific clause detailing my absolute ownership. Next, we included the conditional occupancy agreement, marking the zero-tolerance paragraph regarding verbal or physical abuse. That single clause instantly invalidated his right to reside on the property the moment he shoved me. Then came the financial ammunition. Eleanor printed the metadata report verifying that the digital signature on the bank loan was created from an IP address registered to Brandon's company, not my personal network. She included the timestamp logs showing the systematic drain of Mia's educational fund. Finally, we added the security camera stills from the estate's front porch, clearly showing Brandon signing for the warning letter he claimed he never received. It was a flawless, irrefutable paper trail. The bank appraiser is scheduled to arrive at the estate tomorrow at 9:30 in the morning, Eleanor noted, sliding the final document into the leather portfolio. Brandon is currently hosting a post-event brunch in the garden to secure the final signatures from his investors. They are all still there. Perfect, I replied, taking the heavy black folder from her hands. The leather was cool to the touch. It felt incredibly grounding. I walked out of the law firm and stepped into the bright Seattle morning. The air was crisp and clear. I walked to my car, placed the portfolio gently on the passenger seat, and started the engine. I did not speed. I drove the speed limit the entire way back to the sprawling suburban neighborhood. I listened to classical music. I regulated my breathing, ensuring my heart rate was perfectly calm. I was returning to the exact scene where I had been humiliated just 12 hours prior. But I was no longer the quiet sister trying to keep the peace. I was the legally appointed executor of my grandfather's legacy. Carrying a loaded weapon made entirely of ink and paper, I drove back entirely ready. Before I stepped out of my parked car, I opened the black leather portfolio one last time to review the legal framework. I needed to center my mind on the absolute certainty of the law. People like Brandon thrive on emotional chaos. They use intimidation, loud voices, and aggressive posturing to bend reality to their will. But a legal document does not possess emotions. It does not flinch when you yell at it. To understand why Brandon was about to lose everything, you must understand the impenetrable power of an irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard will, which must pass through a lengthy and public probate court process, a trust is a living legal entity. The moment my grandfather took his last breath, the total ownership of the estate bypassed the courts entirely and vested immediately into my sole control. Brandon operated under the foolish assumption that possession equaled ownership. He believed his squatter's rights and his inflated remodeling invoices gave him legal leverage. He was severely mistaken. The conditional occupancy agreement Arthur had drafted was a masterpiece of protective foresight. It did not merely request good behaviour. It outlined specific objective triggers for immediate eviction. I traced my finger over the printed clauses. Brandon had triggered 3 separate violations within a single 24-hour period. He had used a residential property for unauthorised commercial solicitation by hosting his investor pitch. He had committed financial abuse against a minor residing on the premises by draining Mia's educational fund. Finally, he had committed verbal and physical harassment against the legal trustee. Furthermore, Arthur had completely neutralised Brandon's inevitable counterattack. I looked at the medical addendum Eleanor had included. It was a 3-year comprehensive psychological evaluation. It contained time-stamped videos of Arthur discussing his legal decisions, certified by 2 independent medical professionals. If Brandon ever tried to claim Arthur was suffering from cognitive decline when he signed the trust, the court would simply laugh at him. My grandfather had built a fortress made of paper. He had handed me the keys. All I had to do was turn the lock. I closed the heavy leather portfolio. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My expression was perfectly composed. My pulse was a slow, steady rhythm. I opened my door. The morning sun was exceptionally bright as I walked up the long, winding driveway of the estate. The air smelled of expensive catered food and freshly cut grass. Brandon's post-event brunch was currently in full swing. He had invited the most crucial investors back to the garden to enjoy mimosas and sign the final letters of intent. He needed to close the trap before the bank appraiser arrived. I did not change my clothes. I walked up the stone pathway wearing the exact same silk dress I had worn the night before. The dark red wine stain was completely dry now, spreading across the pale fabric like an oxidized map of his violent temper. It was a deliberate, calculated, aesthetic choice. I wanted every single wealthy investor in that garden to look at my ruined dress and remember exactly how Brandon treated women behind closed doors. As I rounded the corner of the historic house and stepped onto the manicured lawn, the atmosphere instantly shifted. The light clinking of crystal glasses began to fade. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned in my direction. Jessica was the first to see me. She was holding a silver tray of pastries, smiling brightly at a venture capitalist. When her eyes locked onto my stained dress, the colour drained completely from her face. She took a reflexive step backward, nearly dropping the heavy tray. She had assumed I was crying in my apartment, thoroughly defeated and deeply humiliated. She did not expect me to return. I ignored my sister. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, walking with the measured, deliberate pace of a professional stepping onto a stage. The crowd naturally parted to let me through. They stared at the black leather portfolio resting securely under my arm. Near the back of the garden, I spotted the audio control booth set up for the morning speeches. The young sound technician was adjusting a mixing board. He was the same technician who had been monitoring my lapel microphone the previous night. He had heard Brandon push me. He had heard the cruel insults. I caught his eye across the sea of tailored suits. I gave him a single, subtle nod. He nodded back, his hands hovering over the digital sliders. I approached the podium. I stepped onto the small wooden stage Brandon had constructed for his morning address. I placed my black leather portfolio onto the polished podium. I reached forward and tapped the primary microphone twice. The crisp, clear thumping sound echoed perfectly across the sprawling garden. The audio system was fully active. From the far side of the lawn, Brandon finally noticed the sudden silence. He pushed his way through a group of affluent bankers, his face contorting from a practiced, charming smile into a mask of absolute fury. "What do you think you are doing?" Brandon hissed, marching aggressively toward the stage. "Get off that platform immediately. You are trespassing." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his wireless lapel microphone, clipping it hastily to his expensive jacket. He intended to publicly humiliate me again. He wanted his deep, booming voice to drown me out, to frame me as a hysterical, disgruntled relative ruining a professional corporate event. He pressed the activation button on his transmitter. "Security!" Brandon barked into his microphone, pointing a rigid finger at me. "Remove this woman from my property." But nothing happened. Brandon's voice did not project through the massive garden speakers. It remained small, pathetic, and entirely unamplified. He tapped the microphone aggressively, cursing under his breath. He glared at the sound technician in the back booth. The young technician simply stared back, keeping his hand firmly planted on the master mute button for Brandon's audio channel. If you love seeing an arrogant bully lose their audience, tell me in the comments. I leaned slightly toward my own active microphone. "He cannot help you, Brandon," I said. My voice rolled across the garden, rich, resonant, and undeniably powerful. It commanded the attention of every single investor holding a champagne flute. Brandon froze, without the artificial amplification of his microphone. His commanding presence evaporated. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a desperate, angry man standing in a garden he did not own, trying to shout down a woman who held absolute control of the stage. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of 30 seconds. He lost his voice. Panic is a highly visible emotion. It lives in the rapid blinking of the eyes and the sudden shallowness of the breath. Brandon was actively panicking. Stripped of his amplified voice, he resorted to his backup plan. He wildly signalled his personal assistant standing near a digital projector screen, desperate to change the narrative before I could speak. "Play the audio file," Brandon shouted, his unamplified voice cracking slightly. Show them she is lying." The assistant scrambled to the laptop and hit the playback button. Suddenly, my own voice echoed through the garden speakers. I am fully aware of the business proposals. Our family completely supports this redevelopment and the financial restructuring required. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd of investors. They looked confused, glancing between the confident voice on the recording and the calm, stained woman standing at the podium. Jessica looked away, unable to meet the eyes of her wealthy friends. I did not flinch. I waited for the artificial echo to fade completely into the morning air. Then, I leaned back into my microphone. As a professional master of ceremonies, I earn my living analysing audio, I stated, my tone analytical and entirely devoid of anger. If you listen closely to the recording Brandon just played, you will notice 3 critical anomalies. First, the ambient room tone abruptly shifts behind the word completely. Second, there is no natural inhalation of breath between the primary clauses. And third, the metadata on that specific file indicates it was compiled yesterday afternoon. I paused, letting the profound silence wash over the wealthy crowd. Several bankers narrowed their eyes, realizing they were being actively conned. My voice can be hired to host an event, I continued, speaking with deliberate surgical precision, but it has never been sold to legitimize a corporate fraud. That recording is a digital splice, created to hide the fact that the legal owner of this estate never consented to a commercial mortgage. Brandon lunged forward, trying to grab the podium. "Shut up," he screamed. "You are just a bitter hired voice. You own absolutely nothing here." I calmly opened the black portfolio. "Let us consult the paperwork." I did not raise my voice to compete with Brandon's frantic shouting. I simply adjusted my posture and looked down at the highlighted legal text. When you possess the absolute truth, you do not need to scream. Pursuant to the final recorded deed and the terms of the irrevocable trust established by Arthur. I read clearly, articulating every single consonant. The sole legal owner of this property is Ava. Brandon and Jessica occupy this residence strictly under a conditional occupancy agreement. They hold 0 equity, 0 collateral rights, and 0 authority to invite commercial investors onto these premises. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. 2 men in expensive suits standing near the front row immediately placed their mimosas down on a table. "That is a lie," Brandon roared, pointing at me. "This is my house. I remodeled it." "Clause 7 of the occupancy agreement," I continued, seamlessly slicing through his outburst. "Occupancy shall immediately and permanently terminate in the event of verified verbal harassment or physical violence directed toward the trustee, an event that over 200 people witnessed last night." I looked up from the paper and stared directly into Brandon's eyes. His face was entirely pale. The illusion of his immense wealth had been stripped away, leaving him completely naked in front of his financial lifelines. From the back of the garden, a man wearing a plain grey suit walked quietly up the central pathway. He was a professional legal process server Eleanor had hired. He bypassed the confused guests, stepped up to the edge of the stage, and pressed a thick yellow envelope directly against Brandon's chest. "You are officially served with an emergency eviction notice and a commercial cease and desist order," I announced, closing the leather portfolio with a sharp, satisfying snap. "You have exactly 2 hours to vacate my property. If you attempt to remove any fixtures, law enforcement will be immediately notified." Brandon stared at the yellow envelope in his hands. His mouth opened, but he had absolutely no words left. He looked toward his investors, searching for an ally, searching for anyone who still believed his magnificent lie. But they were already turning their backs. The hammer finally fell. The eviction notice rested heavily against Brandon's chest. The garden, which had been buzzing with affluent chatter just 20 minutes prior, was now submerged in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Brandon looked around, his eyes wide and desperate, searching for a friendly face among the crowd of potential investors. He found absolutely none. Then, the older gentleman in the dark grey suit stepped forward. He was the same man I had exchanged a glance with when I was walking out of the party the night before. He was a senior partner at a private equity firm, and more importantly, he had played golf with my grandfather Arthur for over 2 decades. He did not look angry. He looked entirely analytical. "Brandon," the older man said, his voice carrying clearly across the manicured lawn. "You stood in front of this group 30 minutes ago and claimed you acquired this property through a private family transfer. You listed it as the primary collateral in your investment prospectus." Brandon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "This is a private misunderstanding," he stammered, attempting to force a charming chuckle that sounded horribly hollow. "My sister-in-law is simply confused about the legal parameters of the estate." "I am not confused," the older man replied calmly, adjusting his suit jacket. "Arthur was a meticulous man. What exact date did he transfer this estate to your name? And if you truly own the equity, why has the commercial lending bank not successfully verified the title? You promised us absolute transparency." Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sophisticated, confident persona he had spent years crafting was melting away under the weight of a single, logical question. He could not answer the investor because the truth was a direct admission of fraud. He was trapped between a legal eviction notice and the complete collapse of his professional reputation. I stood silently at the podium, watching him drown in the shallow waters of his own lies. I did not need to hurl insults. I did not need to raise my voice. The absolute certainty of the documented truth was doing all the heavy lifting for me. He had no answers. Narcissistic individuals cannot handle public failure. When a person whose entire identity is built on artificial dominance feels cornered, they do not apologize. They double down. They genuinely believe that if they simply explain their reasoning, everyone else will realize they are actually a misunderstood genius. Brandon was no exception to this psychological rule. Seeing the investors looking at him with deep suspicion, Brandon finally snapped. He threw the yellow eviction envelope onto the grass and gestured wildly toward the historic house. "You people do not understand how business works," Brandon shouted, his voice cracking with panicked aggression. "I have invested my time and my corporate resources into managing this property. I only needed my name on the deed for 6 short months. Once the commercial loan cleared, the company would stabilize, and nobody would lose a single dime. I was saving this family." A collective breath was drawn across the garden. Eleanor, standing quietly near the back, simply shook her head. Brandon was so incredibly blinded by his own arrogance that he did not realize what he had just done. In his desperate attempt to justify his actions, he had just publicly confessed to mortgage fraud, intent to embezzle, and unauthorized manipulation of collateral assets. He had shouted his confession into an audience composed entirely of financial professionals. The reaction from the crowd was swift and brutally silent. The older investor, who had questioned him, simply turned around and began walking toward the exit. The others immediately followed his lead. They did not yell. They did not demand explanations. They simply folded the glossy brochures Brandon had printed and dropped them onto the catering tables. Several bankers pulled out their phones to cancel the wire transfers they had authorized earlier that morning. Brandon stood in the middle of the lawn, watching his financial lifelines walk out the iron gates. He reached out, calling a few of their names, promising them guaranteed returns and massive profits. None of them looked back. The garden emptied out in less than 3 minutes, leaving only the caterers, Jessica, Eleanor, Brandon, and me. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. They left him completely. The battle was not entirely over. A desperate man will always grasp at imaginary lifelines. From the shadows of the catering tent, a man wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit stepped forward. He was the corporate consultant Brandon had hired using the money stolen from Mia's educational fund. He held a thin manila folder tightly against his chest, looking incredibly nervous. "We are not leaving," the consultant declared, holding up a single sheet of paper. "I have a legal document right here. It is a superseding will, signed by Arthur exactly 6 weeks before he passed away. It legally revokes the trust and leaves the entire property to Jessica. This eviction notice is completely invalid." For a fraction of a second, the air in the garden grew tense. Jessica gasped, a sudden flicker of hope returning to her tear-stained face. She looked at her husband, desperately wanting to believe he had found a magical solution to save their luxurious lifestyle. Eleanor stepped forward from the back of the garden. She walked up to the consultant, holding out her hand. Reluctantly, he handed her the document. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and read the page for exactly 10 seconds before letting out a soft, dry laugh. "This is a fascinating piece of fiction," Eleanor stated, holding the paper up to the sunlight. "First, the notary seal stamped on the bottom right corner belongs to a commissioned batch that was not released by the state until 3 weeks after Arthur died. It is a chronological impossibility." The consultant turned completely pale. Brandon took a step back, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Second," Eleanor continued, pulling a printed digital analysis report from her briefcase, "the digital metadata embedded in the file you submitted to the county clerk shows it was authored on a computer registered to Brandon's real estate firm just 3 days ago. Presenting a forged testamentary document is a serious felony. If you do not leave this property in 10 seconds, I will call the police and have you arrested as an active accomplice." The consultant did not argue. He snatched his briefcase from the ground, turned around, and practically ran toward the front gates. He abandoned his client without a single backward glance. His final shield vanished. Brandon was escorted off the property by the legal process servers 20 minutes later. He was not allowed to pack a bag. He was not allowed to access the safe. He simply walked down the driveway, completely broken and entirely silent. Jessica remained. Instead of apologizing or showing any remorse for her complicity, she retreated into her deeply ingrained habit of playing the victim. She locked herself in a guest bedroom, pulled out her phone, and began recording a video for her social media followers. She cried on camera, claiming that her cruel sister had ambushed her during a private family event. She told her audience that I was evicting a 7-year-old child out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. Within an hour, the video began generating thousands of angry comments from strangers demanding I show some compassion. My phone vibrated endlessly with messages from distant relatives who had only heard Jessica's highly manipulated version of the events. I did not respond publicly. I did not post a counter video explaining my side of the story. Engaging in a public shouting match is exactly what manipulative people want. It feeds their desperate need for attention. Instead, I opened my email client on my laptop. I drafted a single direct message to Jessica. I did not write a long paragraph about my broken heart. I simply attached the commercial loan application Brandon had submitted to the bank. I highlighted page 4 and hit send. The public noise did not matter to me. The internet would move on to a new drama within 48 hours. What truly mattered was the harsh reality Jessica was about to face when she opened that digital file. I wanted her to see exactly how much her husband valued her loyalty. I wanted her to realize that protecting a toxic relationship does not grant you immunity from the poison. I sent the absolute truth. 10 minutes after I sent the email, the heavy wooden door to the guest bedroom slowly opened. Jessica walked down the hallway, staring down at the glowing screen of her mobile phone. Her eyes were red. But this time, the tears were completely genuine. The artificial victimhood she had projected on the internet had been entirely shattered by the cold, hard numbers printed on page 4 of the bank document. "He forged my signature," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling violently. "He made me a co-guarantor." She looked at me, her face pale with absolute horror. She finally understood the depth of the trap she had blindly supported. Brandon had not simply leveraged my grandfather's house. To secure the massive loan, he had listed Jessica as legally responsible for the debt. He had pledged her personal bank accounts, her jewellery, and the future revenue from her social media brand as collateral. If his failing company defaulted on the commercial loan, the bank would not just seize the house. They would seize everything she owned. He had quietly positioned his devoted wife to take the financial bullet for his failure. "I signed the paper acknowledging he managed the house," Jessica sobbed, clutching her phone to her chest. "But I never agreed to guarantee his corporate debts. He told me he was building a legacy for Mia. He told me we were going to be wealthy." She sank onto the living room sofa, covering her face with her trembling hands. For years, she had allowed Brandon to treat me like an unpaid servant because she believed she was on the winning team. She thought her silence brought her safety. Now, looking at the forged documents, she realised she was never a partner in his grand empire. She was just another asset he was entirely willing to liquidate. The illusion of her perfect marriage collapsed into a pile of fraudulent paperwork. She finally understood that a man who easily disrespects others will eventually disrespect you. The golden illusion finally shattered. Healing a family does not mean erasing the consequences of betrayal. Forgiveness without strict boundaries is simply an invitation for further abuse. 2 days after Brandon was removed from the property, I sat at the dining room table with Jessica and Eleanor. We were not having a casual family meeting. We were establishing a very rigid legal contract. "Mia is completely innocent in this," I stated firmly, looking directly at my sister. "She will not be punished for the profound failures of her parents. She is allowed to live in this house. She will have her own room, and she will attend her normal school." Jessica nodded weakly, looking exhausted. "Thank you. Ava, I will pack my things today." "No," I corrected her, sliding a printed document across the polished oak table. "You will also remain on this property, but only under the strictest conditions." Eleanor adjusted her glasses and outlined the terms. Jessica was required to formally file for legal separation from Brandon to protect herself from his ongoing fraud investigations. She was legally barred from using Mia's image on any social media platforms for financial gain. Furthermore, I was establishing a new, highly encrypted educational trust for Mia that neither parent could ever access. If Brandon sets one foot on this property, or if you violate any of these financial boundaries, you will be permanently evicted. I told her, my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "I am not doing this because we are sisters. I am doing this because a child deserves a stable roof. You have a chance to rebuild your life. Jessica, do not waste it." She signed the paper with a shaking hand. It was a harsh arrangement, but it was fair. Later that afternoon, I moved my belongings into the small, quiet workshop room my grandfather used to occupy. I left the Grandmaster suite entirely empty. I did not need a massive room to feel important. Before the sun went down, I walked down the concrete stairs to the dark basement. I unlocked the heavy door. Barnaby looked up at me, his tail giving a weak, rhythmic thump against the cold floor. I knelt down and gently rubbed behind his ears. "Come on, old man," I whispered softly. I brought the dog upstairs. 3 weeks passed. The aggressive, flashy energy that had infected the estate slowly dissipated, replaced by the quiet hum of an ordinary life. I hired a local contractor to remove the modern chandelier Brandon had installed in the foyer, restoring the original wrought iron fixture my grandfather had loved so much. I stripped away the cheap, superficial paint and allowed the natural grain of the craftsman woodwork to breathe again. It was a Saturday morning. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea and walked out onto the back porch. The garden, which had once been a stage for a fraudulent corporate performance, was now simply a garden. The air smelled of damp soil and blooming hydrangeas. Barnaby was curled up on a thick, comfortable dog bed, sleeping soundly in a bright patch of warm sunlight. His breathing was slow and entirely peaceful. A few feet away, Mia was sitting on the wooden steps, carefully tracing the colourful illustrations in a large picture book. Jessica was inside, preparing breakfast. We did not speak much these days, and our relationship was far from perfectly healed. But there was no yelling. There was no tension. There was no desperate performance required to keep a dangerous man satisfied. I sat down in a wooden rocking chair and took a slow sip of my tea. The heavy weight I had carried in my chest for the last 4 years was completely gone. I did not need to scream to prove my worth. I did not need to accept abuse to earn a place at the table. Arthur was right. A legacy is not something you merely inherit. It is something you actively protect with the unwavering strength of the truth. A family built on lies will eventually collapse, but a life protected by absolute truth will stand forever. If you have ever found the courage to protect your own peace and walk away from toxic illusions, share this story. Let them hear your voice. The house was finally breathing.